Hello friends, my name is Dr. Diksha Vajpayee Tiwari. I teach Geography at Department of Geography, Dayal Singh College, University of Delhi. Today, we'll try and understand the concept of urban slums and squatter settlements. The objective of the present module are to understand the process of urbanization in the world, to comprehend the background processes and factors affecting urbanization of poverty, and to understand the factors and causes impacting the proliferation of slums and squatter settlements. We will also try and comprehend the evolution of slum policies in India. Let us start with an introduction to the concept of slums and squatter settlements. More than half of the world's population lives in urban areas. By 2030, it is projected that over half of residents in low and middle income countries will reside in cities. Since 1950, mankind has endured its most rapid expansion from 2.5 billion to 6 billion people. 60% of this gain has been in urban areas, particularly in the urban areas of the developing world, where the urban population has increased more than sixfold in only 50 years. The huge increase in urban population amounts to a crisis of unprecedented magnitude in urban shelter provision. Every year, the world's urban population is increasing by about 70 million, equivalent to 7 new megacities. These people all need to be provided with shelter, with employment, and with urban services. The stretched capacities of most urban economies in developing countries is unable to meet more than a fraction of these needs, so that the informal sector is providing most of the new employment and housing in environments that have came to be known as informal settlements or slums, where more than half of the population of many cities and towns of developing countries are currently living and working. The rapid and large scale of urban growth has raced far ahead of the provision of services and has precipitated a proliferation of informal settlements and the development of new smaller cities. Without access to water and sanitation, garbage collection or security of tenure, there is an increasing concern of urbanization or poverty. As rural to urban migration takes place, people from rural areas move to urban areas in search of jobs. Also, rural areas are overtaken by expanding urban agglomerations. As a result of this, many low and middle income countries are increasingly concerned with the urbanization of poverty. Let us now understand the distribution of slums in the world. Slums are a manifestation of the two main challenges facing human settlements: development at the beginning of the new millennium, rapid urbanization, and urbanization of poverty. About 1 billion people, or 32% of world's urban population, live in slums, the majority of them in the developing world. Most of them living under life and health threatening conditions, often lacking several of the following conditions: access to adequate clean water, access to improved sanitation facilities, sufficient living space, dwellings of sufficient durability and structural quality, and security of tenure. According to this understanding, almost 1 out of 3 urban dwellers, 1 out of every 6 worldwide, already lives in a slum. Moreover, the locus of global poverty is moving to the cities, a process now recognized as the urbanization of poverty. Without concerted action on the part of municipal authorities, national government, civil society actors, and the international community, the number of slum dwellers is likely to increase in most developing countries. In the next 30 years, the slum population worldwide is projected to rise to about 2 billion. In the year 2001, 924 million people, or 31.6% of the world's urban population, lived in slums. The majority of them were in the developing regions, accounting for 43% of the urban population, in contrast to just 6% in more developed regions. Within the developing regions, sub-Saharan Africa had the largest proportion of the urban population residents in slums in 2001, which was about 71.9%, and Oceania had the lowest, about 24.1%. In between these were South Central Asia, 58%, Eastern Asia, 36.4%, Western Asia, 33.1%, Latin America and the Caribbean, 31.9%, Northern Africa, 28.2%, and Southeast Asia, 28%. Today around the world, a quarter of the urban population live in slums. In developing countries, 881 million urban residents live in slum conditions. In 1990, this figure was 689 million. This represents an increase of about 28% in slum dwellers' absolute numbers over the past 15 years, even though the proportion of the urban population in developing countries living in slums has declined from 39% to 30% during the same period. Slums are spontaneously emerging as a dominant and distinct type of settlement in the cities of the developing world. Since 2000, the global slum population grew on an average by 6 million a year. This means an increase of about 16,500 persons daily. In sub-Saharan Africa, 59% of the urban population lives in slums, and by 2050, Africa's urban dwellers are projected to have increased to 1.2 billion. In Asia and the Pacific, home to half of the urban population of the world, 28% of the urban population resides in slums. However, Asia was at the forefront of successful efforts to reach the Millennium Development Goal 7, Target 7D, with governments improving the lives of an estimated 172 million slum dwellers. In Latin America and the Caribbean region, where regularization of informal housing has historically contributed to providing housing solutions, informal settlements continue to be a significant feature of urban areas, with at least 21% of the region's urban population still residing in slums, in spite of a 17% decrease in this proportion over the last decade. In spite of great success in improving slums and preventing their formation, represented by a decrease from 39% to 30% of urban population living in slums in developing countries between 2000 and 2014, absolute numbers continue to grow, and the slum challenge remains a critical factor for the persistence of poverty in the world, excluding fellow humans and citizens from the benefits of urbanization and from fair and equal opportunities to attain individual and collective progress and prosperity. We will now try and develop an understanding of the concept of the word slum. The word slum was first used in London at the beginning of the 19th century to describe a room of low repute or low unfrequented parts of the town, but has since undergone many modifications in meaning and application. While early definitions of slum dwelling combine physical, spatial, social, and even behavioral aspects of urban poverty, the spread of associations has more recently narrowed. The term slum is usually used to describe a wide range of low-income settlements and or poor human living conditions. These inadequate housing conditions exemplify the variety of manifestations of poverty. Slum at its simplest is a heavily populated urban area characterized by substandard housing and squalor. This definition encapsulates the essential characteristics of slums: high densities and low standards of housing, structures and services, and squalor. The first two criteria are physical and spatial, while the third is social and behavioral. Look at the figure, which shows a relationship between inequality, poverty, and slum formation. Slums result from a combination of poverty or low incomes with inadequacies in the housing provision system, so that poor people are forced to seek affordable accommodation and land that become increasingly adequate. The number of urban people in poverty are to a large extent outside the control of city governments and are swelled by a combination of economic stagnation, increasing inequality, and population growth, especially growth through in-migration. Today, the catch-all term slum is loose and deprecatory. It has many connotations and meanings and is banned from many of the more sensitive, politically correct, and academically rigorous lexicons. It has also varied considerably in what it describes in different parts of the world or even in different parts of the same country. In developing countries, the term slum, if it is used mostly, lacks the pejorative and divisive original connotations and simply refers to lower quality of informal housing. Terms such as slum, shanty, squatter settlement, informal housing, and low-income community are used somewhat interchangeably by agencies and authorities. The coverage of settlement types is even more complex when one considers the variety of equivalent words in other languages and geographical regions. French call it bidonvilles, taudis habitat, precari habitat, spontané, Cuatari irregulares. Spanish call them as asentamientos irregulares, barrio marginal, barraca conventillos, colonias populares, tugorias and solares, bohojos and cuartiras. German call them as Elendes Virtel. Russians call them as Trushtolu. The operational definition of a slum that has been recently recommended by a United Nations expert group meeting held in Nairobi from 28th to 30th October in the year 2002 for future international usage defines a slum as an area that combines to a various extents the following characteristics: restricted to the physical and legal characteristics of the settlement and excluding the most difficult social dimensions. First, inadequate access to safe water. Second, inadequate access to sanitation and other infrastructure. Third, poor structural quality of housing. Fourth, overcrowding. Fifth, insecure residential status. Indeed, a slum has been redefined by the United Nations Programme on Human Settlements, UN Habitat, as a contiguous settlement where the inhabitants are characterized as having inadequate housing and basic services. A slum is often not recognized and addressed by the public authorities as an integral or equal part of the city. This was given by UN Habitat, Urban Secretariat and Shelter Branch in 2002. The United Nations even incorporated slums into the Millennium Development Goals as part of Goal 7 to ensure environmental sustainability. Target 7D is to achieve by 2020 a significant improvement in the lives of at least 100 million slum dwellers, putting area level deprivation and urban poverty on the development agenda. The UN operationally defines a slum as one or a group of individuals living under the same roof in an urban area lacking in one or more of the following 5 amenities. The first one being durable housing, a permanent structure providing protection from extreme climatic conditions. Second, sufficient living area, no more than 3 people sharing a room. Third, access to improved water, water that is sufficient, affordable and can be obtained without extreme effort. Fourth, access to improved sanitation facilities, a private toilet or a public one shared with a reasonable number of people. And fifth, last, secure tenure, de facto or de jure secure tenure status and protection against forced eviction. This was given by UN Habitat in the year 2006 and 7. We will now understand about the characteristics of slums. A review of the definitions used by national and local governments, statistical officers, institutions involved in slum issues and public perceptions reveal the following attributes of slums. First one being lack of basic services. Lack of basic service is one of the most frequently mentioned characteristic of slum definition worldwide. Lack of access to sanitation facilities and safe water sources is the most important feature, sometimes supplemented by absence of waste collection system, electricity supply, surface roads and footpaths, street lighting and rainwater drainage. Secondly, substandard housing or illegal and inadequate building structures. Many cities have building standards that set minimum requirements for residential buildings. Slum areas are associated with a high number of substandard housing structures, often built with non-permanent materials unsuitable for housing given the local conditions of climate and location. Various space and dwelling placement laws may also be extensively violated. Third, overcrowding and high density. Overcrowding is associated with a low space person, high occupancy rates, cohabitation by different families and a high number of single room units. Many slum dwelling units are overcrowded with 5 or more persons sharing one room unit used for cooking, sleeping and living. Next, unhealthy living conditions and hazardous locations. Unhealthy living conditions are the result of a lack of basic services with visible open sewers, lack of pathways, uncontrolled dumping of waste, polluted environments, etc. Houses may be built on hazardous locations. The layout of the settlement may be hazardous because of lack of access ways and high densities of dilapidated structures. Next, insecure tenure, irregular or informal settlement. A number of definitions consider lack of security of tenure as a central characteristic of slums and regard lack of any formal document entitling the occupant to occupy the land or structure as prima facie evidence of illegality and slum occupation. Informal or unplanned settlements are often regarded as synonymous with slums. Next, poverty and social exclusion. Income and capability poverty is considered with some exceptions as a central characteristic of slum areas. It is not seen as an inherent characteristic of slums, but as a cause and often a consequence of slum conditions. Next, minimum settlement size. Many slum definitions also require some minimum settlement size for an area to be considered a slum, so that the slum constitutes a distinct precinct and is not a single dwelling. Example are the municipal slum definition of Kolkata that requires a minimum of 700 square meters to be occupied by huts, or the Indian census definition which requires at least 300 people or 60 households living in a settlement cluster. Living in a slum consists of a combination of these multiple dimensions and not just only one. Let's now elaborate on slums in India. For the Census of India 2001, following definitions of slums have been adopted for enumeration. All specified areas in a town or city notified as slum by state UT administration or local government under any act including a slum act. All areas recognized as slum by state UT administration or local government, housing and slum boards which may have not been formally notified as slum under any act, or a compact area of at least 300 population or about 60 to 70 households of poorly built congested tenements in unhygienic environment, usually with inadequate infrastructure and lacking in proper sanitary and drinking water facilities. Census of India 2011 defined slum as, a slum has been defined as residential areas where dwellings are unfit for human habitation by reasons of dilapidation, overcrowding, faulty arrangements and design of such buildings, narrowness or faulty arrangement of street, lack of ventilation, light or sanitation facilities, or any combination of these factors which are detrimental to the safety and health. For the purpose of census, slums have been categorized and defined as of the following three types. There are notified slums, there are recognized slums, and there are identified slums. Let's understand what are notified slums. All notified areas in a town or city notified as slum by state UT administration or local government under any act including a slum act. There are recognized slums. All areas recognized as slum by state UT administration or local government, housing and slum boards which may have not been formally notified as slum under any act. Then there are identified slums, a compact area of at least 300 population or about 60-70 households of poorly built congested tenements in unhygienic environment, usually with inadequate infrastructure and lacking in proper sanitary and drinking water facilities. These are called the identified slums. Now please look at the figure why slums proliferate in India. According to Census of India 2011, there were about 1,08,227 slum blocks in India. About 37.2% were identified slum blocks, 34.3% were notified slum blocks, and 28.5% were recognized slum blocks. In 2011, there were 137.49 lakh slum households in India. Maharashtra reported the highest number of slum blocks in the country. Top 5 states in terms of slum households to urban households were Andhra Pradesh constituting 35.7%, Chhattisgarh 31.9%, Madhya Pradesh 28.3%, Odisha 23.1% and West Bengal 21.9%. Bottom 5 states in terms of slum households to urban households were Chandigarh 9.7%, Gujarat 6.7%, Jharkhand 5.3%, Assam 4.8% and Kerala 1.5%. Look at the figures households by types of slums. This was given by Census of India, and look at the associated map. We will now discuss the concept of metropolitanization of slum households. In 2011 census, another striking feature of slums in India was an increased concentration of slums in the metropolitan cities of the country. Out of total 137 lakh slum households in the country, about 52 lakhs were in the million-plus cities. About 38% of the slum households are in the 46 million-plus cities. Let us now discuss the process of evolution of approaches to slum policies in developing countries, from negligence to inclusion. Many policy approaches to slums have been attempted during the course of the last decades. During the post-colonial period, particularly the 1950s and 1960s, the issue of slum in developing countries emerged as an important area for urban research and policies. Slum policies have ranged from passively ignoring or actively harassing men and women who live in slums to interventions aimed at protecting the rights of slum dwellers and helping them to improve their incomes and living environment. As a result, various slum strategies were implemented to mitigate the socio-economic, physical, and health well-being of slums and their residents. Comparative analysis of policy approaches to slum shows that currently cities are still practicing many of those approaches that were in use decades ago. For instance, the use of summary eviction and slum clearance in the 19th century European cities can still be witnessed today in major cities of the developing countries, including India. There have been various changes in the governmental attitudes, responses, and policies towards slum since the 1950s. The changing approaches can be discussed under the following major chronological categories: the negligence attitude of 1950s and 1960s, the eviction attitude, site and service schemes in 1970s, the self-help and in-situ upgrading attitude of 1980s, the enabling approach to slums of 1990s, and City Alliance and Cities Without Slum Action Plan post-2000s. Let us now discuss the 1950s and 60s approach of slum policy, the negligence attitude. This approach predominated in most developing countries until the early 1970s. It is based on two basic assumptions: slum are illegal and slum are unavoidable, but temporary phenomena mostly linked with accelerated rural-urban migration that can be overcome by economic development in rural and urban areas. More often than not, slums or informal urban settlements were not even placed on land use maps but were shown as blank spots denoting undeveloped land. During 1950s and 60s, government turned a blind eye to slums and concentrated on public housing. Such attitudes might be deeply influenced by the post-World War II reconstruction policy models, and that they were heavily employed in the industrialized countries, especially Europe. These models were based on heavily subsidized low-cost housing programs that, in the context of high and steady economic growth, brought improvement of housing conditions and resulted in elimination of urban slums. In an effort to achieve similar results, most developing countries responded to the housing needs of the poor through the formal provision of low-cost housing. Making use of the public land reserves and public subsidies, government started massive public housing schemes targeted for low-income groups. But many urban dwellers, especially new migrants in the low-income category, could only afford shelter in marginal and unsuitable land around these new planned settlements. Unfortunately, these projects were implemented in a discriminatory fashion, largely because the indigenous political rulers who replaced the colonial power perpetuated the existing social and class division as the previous master, according to Fanon, 1963. In fact, the main beneficiaries of formal public and planned housing schemes were civil servants and middle and upper income earners, says Fekade in the year 2000. The high cost of this approach was the main reason why the housing needs of the poor were not met. Thus, such public housing schemes were unable to supply sufficient dwellings. Instead, the approach marginalized the majority of urban dwellers and ignored low-income urban dwellers and rural urban migrants who settled there, generating more slums. 1970s and the policy of the eviction attitude, site and service schemes. This was a common response to the development of slums during the 1970s, particularly in an environment characterized by direct and centralized intervention in decision making. The situation was characterized by weak local governance and administration, non-democratic urban management, non-recognition of civil society movements, and lack of legal protection against forced eviction. When it became clear to the public authorities that economic development was not going to integrate the slum population, some government opted for a repressive option, often resulting in mass eviction of the slum population. This policy was driven by affordability and cost recovery strategies. Site and services schemes were credited with enabling shared responsibilities between slum dwellers and government. On the one hand, the program emphasized the participation and the contribution of the beneficiaries to the resettlement process. Similarly, the programs acknowledged and capitalized on the ability of low-income dwellers to mobilize informal resources. On the other hand, local governments were no longer acting as providers but as facilitators, which served them some resources. The implementation of these schemes was severely criticized, especially its demolition and eviction components. Negotiation with slum dwellers who were considered to be illegal squatters were rare. Communities living in informal settlements were rarely offered any viable alternative solutions. Evictions were generally justified by the implementation of urban renewal projects and by the construction of urban infrastructure or for health, sanitary and security reasons. This approach did not solve the problems of slums. Instead, it shifted them to the periphery of the cities, to the rural urban fringes where access to land was easier and planning controls non-existent. The continuing spatial growth of cities brought about an endless cycle of new evictions and the creation of new slums at the periphery of cities outside the municipal boundaries. Other shortfalls of the scheme included the relatively low number of beneficiaries, lack of understanding and clarity around the role of the private sector, lack of planning around the location of new service plots, low or non-existent standards, and the failure to achieve cost recovery. The third approach is the self-help and in-situ upgradation improvement attitude of the 1980s. This approach stemmed from the late 1970s. This approach recognized the slums as durable structural phenomena and not a temporary phase, and thus required a durable and appropriate response. On the one hand, the failure of repressive options like evictions and housings for the poor by the public sector, and on the other hand, increased awareness on right to housing and legal protection against eviction at the international level, and compulsions of policy making in an increased sensitization of the civil society led to the emergence of this approach. In the 1980s, the upgrading strategies emphasized the improvement of communal infrastructure and services within the established slums. In particular, the upgrading projects targeted the improvement of basic services like sewage, water, sanitary garbage collection, electricity and infrastructure, road, market, healthcare and education centers that were lacking or decaying in slum areas. The upgrading programs aimed to achieve three main goals: affordability, cost recovery and replicability. Slum upgrading was considerably cheaper than other alternatives. A 1980 study estimated World Bank upgrading projects to cost about $38 per household compared to $1,000 to $2,000 for a core site and service housing. In terms of affordability, for instance, there were some instances of success. Ebelson in the year 1996 reported that in slum upgrading project at Visakhapatnam, the beneficiaries' income rose by 50% and their assets improved by 82%. There were specific problems with this approach. First, the program was implemented and financed by foreign agencies, which over time gradually reduced their financial support to the various projects. Governments did not follow through with services, communities did not maintain the facilities, and governance structure disappeared once international aid experts exit. The relative importance of the upgrading budget of the World Bank went from 42% in the late 1970s to 8% in late 1980s. Second, further reviews showed that the upgradation programs did not contribute to any poverty reduction or problems regarding unemployment and land security. On the contrary, with the upgradation and improving infrastructure and services led to an increase in real estate prices and land speculation, which led to outmigration of the original allottees and in-migration of several middle-income groups in their settlements. Third, upgradation programs only reached a small portion of slums and did not develop into an ambitious project that could address the shortage of shelter on a city-wide scale. Also, the upgradation of communal services did not improve individual dwellings, and thus on various occasions, the socio-economic and physical environment within the upgraded area continued to deteriorate. Then came 1990s and an enabling approach to slums. The progression of slum upgrading, dealing with the issues of secure titles and economic development in slums, brought an awareness of the need to involve slum dwellers not only in the construction processes of slum improvement, but also in the decision making and design processes that establish priorities for action and support for implementation. Thus, from the mid-1980s to a culmination in the Habitat Agenda of 1996, the enabling approach was developed to coordinate community mobilization and organization. Enabling policies are based on the principles of subsidiarity, and they recognize that to be efficient, decision concerning the investment of resources in domestic, economic, social, physical development have to be taken at the lowest effective levels. For the majority of activities in connection with the improvement of slums, the lowest effective level is that of the community and the neighborhood. But for the decisions to be effectively implemented, communities require supports in the form of training, organizational assistance, financial help, etc. The governance role is to ensure that such supports are provided. The enabling approach advocated 7 major aspects: development of housing financing schemes, targeting of subsidies, encouraging property rights including security of tenure, improving infrastructure, auditing and removing barriers, restructuring building industries, and reforming institutions. In the 1990s, the enabling approach was implemented through security of tenure strategies largely supported by international agencies, namely UN, Habitat and the World Bank. The assumption was that although slum dwellers do not necessarily have the legal title over the land, they could undertake improvement on their properties without fear of eviction. The enabling approach, via its emphasis on security of tenure, also postulated that the availability of and the accessibility to urban land provide a sense of belonging and brings stability to an urban area. The capability of slum dwellers to improve the quality of their environments can be seen in the project in Dar es Salaam in Africa, whereby through securing the land, residents had the incentive and motivation to clean their environment. Another example is the Million Houses program of Sri Lanka, where the government provided the necessary support and security of tenure, and the rest was done by the communities themselves. There are some limitations to this approach also. This policy tends to advantage the slum lords and land grabbers. So when regulation does occur, the slum lords resell or rent the land to city dwellers at a much higher price because the land value has increased with the security. The slum dwellers who were on rent thus have to vacate and settle somewhere else in a slum-like conditions. Post 2000s City Alliance and Cities Without Slum Action Plan is what the strategy to slums has been. Keeping aside a fractional and piecemeal approach towards slums in 1999, the World Bank and UN Habitat initiated the City Alliance and Cities Without Slums Action Plan, which constitutes a part of the United Nations Millennium Declaration goals and targets. The main innovations in this policy is to move from the physical eradication or upgrading of slums adopted by past policies to start to address one of the fundamental reasons why slums exist in the first place: poverty. The action plan recognized that slums are largely a physical manifestation of urban poverty, and to deal with them effectively, future actions and policies should also associate urban and slum stakeholders in the poverty reduction and eradication campaign. The creation of the Cities Alliance reflects a new approach to urban policy and management by 4 principal constituencies: the urban poor, local authorities and their associates, national governments, bilateral agencies, and multilateral agencies like World Bank and UN Habitat. Advancing collective know-how in working with cities is an objective of the Cities Alliance. Its partners have agreed to pool their resources and experience in order to focus on 2 key interrelated priorities for urban poverty reduction: city development strategies which link local stakeholders' vision for their city with clear priorities for action and investment; city-wide and nationwide slum upgrading that aims to contribute to the improvement of the living conditions of at least 100 million slum dwellers by 2020, with an interim target of improving 5 million to 10 million lives by 2005 in accordance with the Cities Without Slum Action Plan. The Cities Alliance was launched in 1999 and 10 governments were included. They were Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, the UK and the US. The alliance is currently working in partnership with the local national authorities of Brazil, El Salvador, Madagascar, Mauritania, Nigeria, Rwanda, Swaziland, South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Bangladesh, Cambodia, China, India, Indonesia, Nepal, Pakistan, Philippines, Vietnam, Iran, Yemen, Mozambique, Kenya, Ethiopia, Jamaica and Bulgaria. The approach, though encouraging, but has been criticized on various grounds. First, poverty is just one of the components of slum creation. The approach is not comprehensive enough to account for other variables that account for slum incidence. Second, the targets set are too little and too late to make an impact to the situation. By 2020, it is estimated that there will be 1.7 billion slum dwellers, and this approach will only seek to improve the lives of about 100 million slum dwellers. Third, no measures are identified to curb the emergence of new slums in these cities. Finally, in conclusion, we will talk about the way forward. There is no doubt that economic development and urban development are natural corollaries, but this also is true that both these processes depend upon social inclusion, smart investment, good governance, and environmental responsibility. Efficient implementation of slum policies will require strong partnerships between government investors and private developers to affect the global and household quality of life. The policies and practices that provide low-income families with quality homes and access to essential services need to be action-oriented, forward-thinking and sustainable so that cities become resilient and are able to fulfill the new urban agenda. Thank you.